Hi students, this is Module 5 video. It's helping you prepare your research project outline. The outline is going to be due in a couple of weeks here after the midterm, I believe. And so to do your outline is at this point I just need you to pick a topic and understand what needs to be done as you frame that topic for this research project. And if it doesn't frame properly, you probably need to pick another project topic for your project. So let's get started. I'm going to give you two examples in this short video of stories which I read. They start as a journalistic story, something in the news where somebody's research made the news. Okay, and that's where I want you to start as well. Something that caught your attention, that you heard about, somebody told you about, or you saw it on a banner story online, or you saw it on the evening news. In this case here, the one that catches my eye, of course, is anything to do with anybody who's gay and research about being gay. So an excellent example of what a research project outline should accomplish. There's 7 points that I want you to look for. Number one, I want you to identify what secondary data you will use as your starting point. So when you see something that catches your story about research or about somebody's research, I want you to be able to identify in that that there is some secondary data that you can use as your starting point. In this case here, men with older brothers are more likely to be gay. Study expanding to biological origin. So several years ago somebody did a study and they found that if the more older brothers you had, it became logarithmically more probable, very, very remote still, 3 to 5%, maybe 6% chance of somebody being born gay. But that chance increased if you had older brothers. So that study was done several years ago. Now they are actually going back and they're proposing, based on the first research, some deeper research, which is exactly the kind of idea which I want you to think about as a potential researcher. If you see some data that didn't go deep enough, I want you to think in your mind, what could I do? Even just thinking about it, you don't actually have to do the research, but what do you think could come from somebody else's research if you had the money, the resources, and education to expand on it? So what's your starting point going to be, and is there secondary data available? 2, tell us what you are going to do with that secondary data you found. So here, 7 years ago, a study made the headlines. So there is a study that was done 7 years ago. That's your starting point. You've got that data as secondary data. Tell us what you are going to do with that secondary data you found. Well, here, by looking deeper into the possible biological basis of homosexuality, what happens with the mother biologically that increases the likelihood that a boy will be gay if he has older brothers. Okay, number 3, go into detail about the secondary data that you found. This will later be expanded and grow into your literature review. Okay, so read through the story. See if it gives you enough meat to sink your teeth into. Here it says, his research led him to conclude. Okay, we have a conclusion from this researcher. Bogert studied 944 gay and straight men, including some who were raised by non-biological male siblings. Raised with non-biological. So this example report that I'm giving here is one single source. Now when you put your research project together, you need to find a research topic that has 2 strong sources of secondary data. So this is an example of one. So then you would have to go out and find a second story that either diminishes the credibility of this one or supports it. Either one. You can go with either one, because what you're doing is you're accumulating this secondary data that tells you what you can do with it in your research project. So that's where we want to go with that. So so this is what we're looking for. Point number 3. Go into some, is there enough secondary data that will be able to grow into an expanded literature review? Somebody else, your write-up about what somebody else wrote about. Point number 4, give an outline of where you want to go with your theory and describe what dependent and independent variables you hope to examine and why. Draw your model to help you complete this part. This is where you go into, does X correlate with Y somehow? Your independent variable and your dependent variable. So here he suggests, this researcher suggests, that there is probably a biological basis to the older brother effect. So he's got the hypothesis, and he's identified what his dependent variable is. Testing specifically the underlying biological effect of the older brother. He told you what his independent variable is going to be. How many older brothers do they have? and suggested that this mechanism could be a maternal immune response, a hormone change in the womb, a gestational factor. This is what he's looking for in this survey. The previous studies that he did showed that the older brothers is correlated to a higher probability of being gay. Now he's actually trying to figure out a biological cause, something in the gestational behavior factor of the mother. And identify your study population. This just happens to be on the same screen capture that I did here. We have a study looking at mothers of gay and heterosexual men and seeing if there is a maternal immune response. So that's something very unique and new. So he's looking at the mothers of gay children, gay boys. Point number 6, describe your methodology. In your final report, this will grow into an entire section of your write-up. So you're going to have a methodology section in your final research project. Right now, all you have to do is just give me a paragraph in your outline that tells me that the story that you found has enough meat in it that you can actually pull out this methodological analysis. Just a paragraph at this point is fine. Point number 7, give an idea of what you hope will be the conclusion after you complete your research. This will become your hypothesis and research question in your first draft. So you're looking for something to support your way of looking at this research, your interpretation of this research, your idea about where you would go if you had the resources to do your own research, building on this as historical data. So, point number 6, describing your methodology in your final report. This researcher says that isolating the exact biological mechanism or process will support the nature side of the nature versus nurture debate. So this is where he's going to dig into the exact biological mechanism. And the idea of where you hope this will do, he's telling you, I think there's strong evidence that people who believe that there's a biological basis to sexual orientation tend to be more tolerant to sexual minorities. So what his hypothesis is that if men truly are born gay, that there is a biological explanation for that. Then the argument that this is a gay lifestyle loses a lot of wind out of its sail. It doesn't gain as much traction because it's the idea that we are evolutionary beings. We are creatures on this earth just like all of the other animals. And there are mechanisms that happen in the body which create birth anomalies that, although being rare and not frequent, are still natural consequences that happen in the gestational period. So this is where he's going with his research, hoping that it will create a bigger, a more tolerant element in society that's saying, hey, this is perfectly natural and it's happened since forever, beginning of time, and it will continue to happen because this is just part of pregnant women having babies. And so that's that topic there. The other topic which I want you to look at is a completely different flavor. As you know, my research involves inner city work and marginalization and vulnerable communities. So in this case here, the legacy of slavery still fuels anti-black attitudes in the South. Once again, we're going to go through the 6 points. Identify what secondary data you will use as your starting point. So in the opening paragraph and actually closing paragraph, this person identified his secondary data. He performed a new county-by-county analysis of census data and opinion polls of more than 39,000 Southern whites, and the author drew on publicly available data, including the 1860 census. So that identified in this article where he got the data, where they got the data. It was a team of researchers. Tell us what you are going to do with that secondary data you found. They are going to take a look at it where slavery and the plantation economy dominated are much more likely to express more negative attitudes towards blacks than their fellow Southerners who lived in nearby areas. So that's where this secondary data went at that point in time. Go into detail about the secondary data that you found. This will later be expanded and grow into your literature review. So he's got a chart here, which is very, very informative. And anytime you can find a chart with your data, whether it's a graph, whether it's a pictographic like this, that's going to really make your research that much easier to do because you will be able to borrow charts like this and put them into your PowerPoint. So that's a very good starting point, is to actually find these kinds of charts, which will make it a lot easier for you to explain your research project on a PowerPoint in your presentation. The slaves were concentrated in counties where cotton thrived, as shown in the above map. So from the 1860 census or 1880 census, I forget what it was, they found the concentrations where slaves were very, very highly concentrated, 81 to 100%. Give an outline of where you want to go with your theory and describe what dependent and independent variables you hope to examine and why. Okay, so it is believed to be the first to demonstrate quantitatively. So this is the quantitative analysis that this person's looking at, which is very unusual to find something that's actually quantitative. I talked about econometrics, which is often seen as a way to skew things by doing this reductionist idea of taking qualitative emotions and interpretations out and just going straight on what the numbers. Well, this is actually an exception to the rule, because when you just look at the numbers, this comes up with some really, really convincing material. Even when other dynamics often associated with racial animosity are factored in, and slavery does not explain all forms of current-day racism, but the data clearly demonstrates that the legacy of the plantation economy and its reliance on the forced labor of African Americans continues to exacerbate racial bias in the Deep South, now almost 150 years later. Point number 5, identify your study population, 39,000 Southern whites and American adults. That's who they were targeting. Describe your methodology in your final report. This will grow into an entire section. Again, comparing. So this is their methodology. Again, comparing the county-by-county data, the researchers found evidence of the relationship between racial violence. And it goes between 1882 and 1930. Lynching rates were not uniform, but instead were highest where cotton was king. 10% increase in a county's slave population in 1860 was associated with a rise of 1.86 lynchings per 100,000 blacks. So it's not like you had more blacks, you had more lynchings. You had more blacks and you almost had double the number of lynchings if there was a higher concentration of blacks. And every 10% increase in the concentration of black slaves in the historical context doubled the lynching rates. So you go up 20%, you would almost go up 3.6. If you went up 30% in black population, it would go up almost 6 points. So this is the correlation that he found. It's an algorithmic increase in lynchings. Give an idea of what you hope will be the conclusion after you complete your research. This will become your hypothesis and research questions. I really want you to focus on this. This is a fascinating study. But how is it possible that an institution so long outlawed continues to influence views in the 21st century? This is the author's hypothesis, which was borne out and supported. The author points to both economic and cultural explanations. Although slavery was banned in the 13th Amendment, the economic incentives to exploit former slaves persisted well into the 20th century. Before mechanization, cotton was not really economically viable without massive amounts of cheap labor, explains Sen. The researcher's name is Sen. After the Civil War, Southern landowners resorted to racial violence and Jim Crow laws to coerce black field hands, depress the wages they were paid, and tie tenant farmers to the plantations, whereas slavery only required a majority of powerful whites in the state to support it as an institution called slavery. Widespread repression and political violence required the support and involvement of entire communities in order to perpetuate this kind of extortion of labor of black former slaves. So in order to have that kind of extortion out of this minority population, well, in some cases even a majority population, they had to terrorize this population and say, look, we can make things a lot worse for you if you don't continue to work on our cotton farms for dirt, nothing, cheap. And so this exploitation, this extortion of their wages, of their labor, was historically what has been carried down 150 years, because that kind of violence against blacks, where they needed their labor in order to harvest the cotton, created this culture where entire communities had to support that kind of extortion and oppression. And so that's the legacy that we have now, according to this map. So in writing up your research, a helpful structure for writing any length of a report is to think in this way. What's your thesis statement? Summarize your theory or hypothesis. Ensure that you've clearly identified your unit of analysis, dependent variable, independent variables, intervening variables. Review the work of others. So what was their epistemology? You'll have to look that up. Will you depart from that in your work? Do you agree with what they did, or do you think they had a flaw in what they did? Either way, it's perfectly valid. Outline your approach. What is your methodology? So your diagram and your quantitative, qualitative, or mixed methods approach, and what is your conclusion or expected conclusion in this case here. What do you expect to find? This all needs to be in your outline. It will be expanded in your first draft, and then it'll be finalized and presented. It'll be presented to the class as a PowerPoint, and then it'll be finalized with all of the feedback that you get through this whole process into a final 8 to 10 page report. But these elements will just continue to grow and be fleshed out and developed.